In this class, I'll be discussing effect of tax on the market. So when we're talking about effect of tax on the market, we are simply talking about the effect of tax on two things that makes up of the market: the price and the quantity. So we'll be looking at the effect of tax on the market price and the quantity demanded and supplied in the market. So here we'll be using graphs to illustrate this effect. Let's go. So suppose we have the market for a particular product, and we know that market has two sides, the demand side and supply side. So here we have the price, here we have the quantity, and this is the origin. So here we have, let's say this is supply curve, and we have the demand curve. These are the two sides that make up of the market. So here we have the equilibrium. This is the equilibrium, and this is the quantity, and this is the corresponding price. This is the market. If there is no tax imposition, this is the market, and this is the price obtainable in the market, and this is the quantity obtainable in the market without tax. Now, suppose government imposes a tax on the seller. So mind you, whether the government imposes a tax on the seller or on the buyer, the effects on the market is going to be the same. So let's first take, for instance, the imposition of a tax on the seller. So let's assume that we have this market, we are going to redraw this. So no tax here, no tax. This case, no tax. So let's consider this case, okay? That is case 1. So let's assume that tax is imposed, that is tax on seller. So we have tax on sellers. So we are going to redraw this. So we have this. Let's have our market. So we have the quantity just like this. Quantity, we have the price, we have the origin. So I'm going to redraw the same thing here. So we have S. So this is demand curve. So here, without any disturbance, we have Q, okay, and this is P. So here I'm calling this one P naught, and I'm calling this one Q naught, and this is P naught. Okay, now this is the original supply curve, and this is the original demand curve. So, but we want to look at a situation whereby government imposes a tax on the seller, not on the buyer. Nothing is imposed on the buyer, but the tax is only imposed on the sellers. Now, let's assume there is a tax imposition on the seller. So, which of the curves will be affected? Because supply curve is associated with sellers. So, it is supply curve that will be affected, while the demand curve will not be affected. So, an imposition of tax on the sellers will shift the supply curve to the left. That is leftward shift in supply curve. Therefore, we have a new supply curve here. Okay, so I call that one S plus T. That is S, the original supply curve, plus T when there is motion of tax. So supply curve will shift to the left. Okay, so I can call this, let me call this I can call this E0, that's E naught, if I like, okay? So let me just call this E, okay? So this is the new equilibrium, okay? So you can see that here we have the new price, that is the corresponding price here. So we can see the interaction of the new supply curve and the original demand curve, because demand curve has not shifted. So we have P, okay? And we have Q. Okay, so because of the imposition of this tax, so the price that the buyer will pay, that the consumer will pay in the market, will be different from the price the seller will receive in the market. Because depending on the level of demand, so the buyers and sellers may need to share the burden of the tax. Okay, so let's go. What we are saying here is that look at this P. This is the price, the new price in the market, and this is the price. This is the amount the consumer is paying in the market. I call it PC. Okay, what price, that is, what price is this? Is the seller receiving in the market? Okay, so the price the sellers are receiving in the market is determined by the whole supply curve. So look at this. From here, we trace it down up to the original supply curve. Then we trace it back to the price axis here. So this is what the sellers are receiving. The buyers are paying PC, the seller are receiving PS. Okay, now, okay, but without tax, the price is peanut. But because of the tax imposition, okay, now the price of the product has risen to PC, that is from P not to PC, okay, and the price that the seller received has fallen from P not to PS. Originally, if there is no tax imposition, the seller will receive exactly amount the buyers are paying in the market, which is P. Okay, the same thing as P not F. Okay, but because of tax imposition, so think of it in terms of this, both the sellers and the buyers sharing the burden of tax. Okay, sharing the burden of tax. So what we are saying here is that the gap between this, okay, and this is tax, representing the tax per unit. The tax per unit, okay, that is the tax per unit sold, the tax per unit of the product sold in the market. Okay, in other words, the tax per unit sold is equal to PC minus PS. Okay, PC minus PS. Okay, now in order to make it clear, more understandable and make it clearer to you, so let me use figures now. Okay, you can see, before I use the figure, you can see that here you have the quantity has fallen from Q not to Q because of the imposition of tax. Now, in order to make it more understandable and clearer, so let me use some figures there so that you understand it better. So here, let's say we have let's say here for PS here, let's say the original price here is 10, okay, without imposition of tax. Okay, so look at here, like we say this is 10, okay, and let's say this is 20. So it's an assumption. Okay, that is 10, 20 here. 10, 20. Okay, so let me say this is 15. Okay, this is 50. Right? Now, let's say government imposes a tax, a unit tax, that is for every unit of the product sold by a seller, government charges 5 naira. Okay, meaning that the tax per unit T is equals to 5. Okay, is equals to 5. So this 5, who is going to pay this 5 naira tax? Is it the seller? It is the seller or the buyer? Okay, so depending on the level of demand. So most of the time, okay, especially when we have elastic demand or inelastic demand, okay, so or unitary elastic demand. So both the buyers and sellers usually share the burden, okay, of the tax. Okay, so because of this, the sellers cannot say, let me just add 5 naira to 10 naira and sell my product as 15 naira. Because he knows that the sellers know that the buyers might run away from the product. Okay, because the people respond to the same thing. they will respond to that increase in price by reducing the quantity they buy. Okay, now what the sellers will not do is that seller can pass a portion of this 5 naira, that is part of this 5 naira, be it maybe 3 naira to the buyer, okay, and the seller will now sacrifice the remaining 2 naira, okay. So in other words, the seller can now sell the product at, let's say, 13 naira, okay. You can see this 13 naira, we look at this 13 naira, so it means that the seller has been able to pass 3 naira to the buyers, okay. But it remains a balance of 2 naira. Who is going to pay that 2 naira? It's the seller, okay. The seller will pay the balance of 2 naira, so meaning that the seller will not receive the original price, okay. So the price the seller is going to reduce will also reduce, okay. So therefore the seller is okay, oh, let me receive 8 naira, okay. Though you can see now, without tax the seller will have received 10 naira, okay, and the quantity sold and bought will have been 20 units. But because of the 5 naira tax imposition, okay, and because of the last of demand that favors the sellers have been able to pass 3 naira out of this 5 naira to the buyers, okay. Therefore, the new price, that is the price the buyers pay in the market, is now 13 naira. You can see the gap. This is 3 naira, okay, and the seller will also what suffer the balance by receiving 8 naira instead of what 10 naira, okay. So therefore, therefore the amount of tax, okay, that is the tax per unit, you remember the other time I said the tax per unit is equals to the price paid by the buyers minus the price received by the seller, okay. Therefore we have 13 minus 8, which is equals to 5. Is it, okay. So that is exactly the way that is the effect of the tax on the seller on the market equilibrium price and quantity, okay. You can see the quantity has fallen to 15 units, okay. Hope this is clear. So thank you. See you in the next video.